Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Angela Murray, Director of Healthcare Solutions at Inmar Intelligence. Today's panel discussion topic is adapting your pharmacy contracting to a changing landscape. We will hear a great conversation on how best to tackle payer contracting, direct and indirect remuneration, or DIR, and more, with each panelist bringing forward their unique perspectives. From a housekeeping perspective, please utilize the Zoom Q&A to send us any questions that you have. We'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And if for some reason we can't get to your question today, we will follow up via email. It is my honor and privilege to introduce my colleagues and today's expert panelist. First, we have Chris Smith, Director of Product Strategy. Then we have Kevin Barton, our VP of Healthcare Strategy, and George Kowalski, Senior Solution Expert. Chris, Kevin, and George are all pharmacists by trade. Their vast experience and expertise make them effective thought leaders in the pharmacy industry. Now, a little bit of the business side of this. This panelist presentation represents each individual's point of view. It is not legally binding from a legal or regulatory perspective. This presentation is being recorded, and the link in the presentation will be shared in a follow-up email. Okay, let's kick off with a few questions. First, in these economic conditions, we often spend a lot of time discussing pharmacy challenges and opportunities. Today, we want to start off on a positive note, and so I'm going to ask Kevin to share some of pharmacy's biggest wins in recent years.
Yeah, thank you, Angela, and I appreciate everyone hopping on the call. To take it back a little bit, I think the expansion of tech responsibilities has been a big win. So pharmacists we all hear practice at the top of their license for offerings such as test and treat. Some states have even created the opportunity for additional revenue for clinical services billed under the medical benefit, which is exciting. One of the reasons, among others, I can say I'm proud to be an Arkansas pharmacist is the work that was done for Rutledge versus PCMA. I know George will go into a bit more detail on that. But DIR reform is at least a base hit, if not a double, in our effort to head in that right direction. So a very exciting journey with regard to DIR. But just a couple of other things, between the Health and Human Services recent extension of the PrEP Act through December of 2024, along with the introduction of both the Pharmacy and Medically Underserved Areas Enhancement Act and the Equitable Community Access to Pharmacist Services Act, both mouthfuls, but several initiatives that continue to hopefully create more ways that pharmacists can serve their community and generate revenue while doing so. But George, what are your thoughts?
Kevin, I think you hit the nail on the head, especially around some of the technician initiatives that are out there. I'd even go so far as to say that the wins are actually gaining momentum, some serious momentum actually. To hit what you talked about on Rutledge versus PCMA, PCMA being the Pharmaceutical Care Manufacturers Association, or Care Management Association, that's the lobbying group for the payers. The fact that that was a major blow to payers when the Supreme Court of the US removed the #1 argument that payers have put forth for why they couldn't be regulated by the states. Payers have claimed for years that they were exempt from regulation because of the ERISA law. Well, the ERISA law set standards for benefits, and the Supreme Court found that there was no mention of pricing. So the payers' argument that their pricing couldn't be regulated was thrown out. So what happened in parallel to that is, that was a national effort on the part of NACDS and a number of other organizations. The states have picked up the torch and they're examining their own cost of doing business with payers. And so, you've got a number of states out there that have enacted some pretty strong laws, and they're focusing on transparency and accountability. And then I think, if you're not following, you need to start following what's going on in Washington right now around the PBM Reform Act that's making its way through Congress. This is a great sign. The fact that this has bipartisan support, the fact that anything has bipartisan support in Washington is a miracle. But the fact that this has bipartisan support is hopefully a really good omen that meaningful change is actually on the horizon. And I just want to go back and comment about the national organizations, NCPA, APHA, NACDS, and there's a host of others. What they did was they started to work collaboratively. And when they did that, they did a great job of educating politicians on what is, our businesses can be abstract and a lot of people don't necessarily understand it, but it's that education that they put forth that really made, turned this really into a big win. Angela?
All right, thank you both. Those are definitely some great wins. I personally look forward to more of that in the coming months and years. Shift gears just a little bit. Let's keep it positive, but jump over to George again to tell us the top 5 best practices a pharmacy should know before contracting with payers.
Of course, Angela. I think before we get started on that, I want to level set on something. Regardless of the contract itself, it's very important to realize how much the market has shifted in recent years as to who's actually paying for prescriptions. So I think a lot of you are expecting one thing, but the slide you see now shows a snapshot about who's actually paying for the prescriptions when the patient's walking out the door. So this may or may not be new data for some of you, but I think regardless of what you think and what this slide shows, what you have to remember is that the dollar amount that the patient is paying is still primarily dictated by the payer, because there's discount cards and all sorts of things in there that dictates that actual number. So, best practices. The contract is always the source of truth. Monitor the performance of your contract. Contract parameters should be clear and measurable. Develop a relationship with the payer and or the PSAO, and then know the laws that govern your contracts. So let's dive in a little bit. So the contract is the source of truth. Know your contract. Read it through, understand the implications of what you signed and how long you and the payer are bound by it, when it starts, when it ends. For AWP minus contracts, know those rates and verify that you're being paid on a claim-by-claim basis to the negotiated rate. For effective rate contracts, which are now the predominant type of contracts out there, beware of reconciliations that don't adhere to the contract. And in order to do that, you need to know what's included in your contract and what's excluded in that contract. Monitor the performance of your contract. This is the number one thing I want you to take away from this list. Monitor and then monitor some more. We're going to talk about this in a bit. Chris is going to go into some detail, but this is crucial. And so the best way to do this is to utilize a performance monitoring tool, or maybe you have one of your own or develop your own that shows you exactly what you've been paid in comparison to what you should have been paid. In the case of effective rate contracts, you're also going to need to know the formula and how to calculate those effective rates. It goes back to what I said in know the parameters, or that your contract is always the source of the truth. Know what's in and know what's out. Any contract, whether it be a payer contract or any contract, real estate, what have you, should contain clear and measurable definitions of the parameters that you're going to be held to. So this means understanding everything from the definition of a brand or a generic. It's not cut and dry. There's all sorts of ways to interpret that, to the pricing methodology used to pay claims. Is it AWP minus? Is it WAC plus? Is it NADAC? What is it? And then know where to find these definitions. Are they in the contract? Are they in the provider manual? Are they in the statement of work? Where are they? Understand when they're updated and understand where they're going to be published. And so, and this one is kind of intuitive. Develop a relationship with your payers and or the PSAO, who's negotiating rates on your behalf. This is going to dictate the success of your business. And so I think it all boils down to any relationship. Communication is the key to a successful one. Enough said there. And lastly, in the slide you're looking at right now, know the laws that govern payer contracts on both a national and state level. So what you're seeing here is, the 5 states that are highlighted in orange, Ohio, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Florida, they've enacted probably the most stringent laws out there around payer reform. And that's not to say that that the other 45 states are not doing anything. Every state has some sort of regulation around payer reform now. But common themes, what you're seeing out there is auditing standards, licensure and registration, banning clawbacks, those type of things. And it's here on the screen as to what it is. And I encourage you all to go out and take a look to see what your state has done and be knowledgeable. So, Angela, back to you.
All right. Thanks, George. That is so helpful. And, we know that there's a lot of best practices, but certainly that summed it up in kind of what are the most important. Also, to add to that, we definitely know that, like you mentioned, the importance of measuring and managing inclusions and exclusions, specifically with the shift to effective rate contracts. So, Chris, can you tell us more about the effect of effective rate contracts on the overall marketplace?
Sure, Angela. Glad to. Thanks. But first, let's level set here and make sure that everybody has at least a basic understanding of what we mean in a traditional AWP minus contract versus an effective rate contract. So on the left side of the chart here, the traditional AWP minus contract, especially think brands as we're talking through this example, right, is the AWP minus a fixed percentage. You'll see the examples below. We're talking AWP minus 18.25. As George indicated, right, the description on these and AWP minus is according to the contract, except where there's exceptions, every single claim should be paid according to that rate. So if all things are going well, you'll see AWP minus 18.25 on every single claim. Versus an effective rate contract, where that same rate, if we have an AWP minus 18.25, the rate could vary claim to claim, but during a defined period of time, at the end of that time, we'll true up or measure back to that 18.25%. So you can see here, the three examples, claim 1 was paid at minus 18.25, claim 2 was paid at minus 18, and claim 3 was paid at minus 18.5. When you add up all the AWP, you add up all the ingredient revenue, you take that and divide it out, you've got an effective rate here, a brand of effective rate of minus 18.32. So in this scenario, the pharmacy would have been underpaid by 0.07% of AWP, and they would be owed that money. So now that we've got kind of that firm understanding of what we're talking about, we'll move on to how to manage those contracts. And then, Angela, I'll get back to answering your question about what the impact has been. So when you're thinking about managing those contracts, first off, we've already talked about the AWP side, managing claim by claim, both on that reconciliation and variance reporting. You need that method of reconciliation with all those different metrics and understanding, again, what's in and what's out of your contract. So you can say, hey, these particular claims or this set of claims was not paid exactly at that minus 18.25 instance we shared before. There are some challenges there, right? There's a bunch of things that might happen, inclusion, exclusion. Again, that we talked about the brand side. The generic side, there's a lot of other things to consider, right? Was there a UNC provision in that contract? Was there a MAC provision in that contract? And frankly, if you're looking at, say, I have 15, 20, whatever claims that weren't paid at that particular rate, it might not even be worth it to spend the time and energy to go after a true up or reconciliation event. Some PBMs charge research fees. We've seen examples where it was a $150 research fee from a PBM to go cure a $100 mispayment, right? Nobody's going to go chase that. So understand, again, the provisions of the contract. But that proof point on the AWP minus side was every claim paid at that rate. Now contrast that with the effective rate, right? So we're going to put all these claims into a basket with all their AWPs, all of the ingredient revenues. We're going to true all those up. But we want to understand during that course of the period where we are from a variance perspective, so you know how to manage that particular contract, because different things are going to happen for a pharmacy depending on if you're overpaid or underpaid. So that method of reconciliation then becomes, at the end of that time period, we're going to compare what we've got on our pharmacy side to what the PBM is giving us from their data. And again, challenges there, a number of challenges. It's a big data event. You could be way off by inclusion, exclusion criteria. That goes back to that tip that George gave. Know what's in the contract. Angela mentioned as well, what's in, what's out. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you've negotiated for the best possible inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because what can happen here from an implication standpoint is there could be millions of dollars of swings either way. for what you owe, either what you owe to the PBM or what the PBM owes you. Neither one of those situations is good. So again, understand those proof points and where you land. Now, Angela, I'll answer your question since we're all on the same page. So I think really the impact of effective rate contracts depends on your viewpoint. So for many, when you went to an effective rate contract, you gave something up. You might have given up 50 or 200 basis points in generic reimbursement or 50 basis points in reimbursement on a brand side for a more predictable rate. And sometimes that makes a lot of sense if you can forecast that more accurately, if you can true it up on a given cadence. For others, giving up any revenue for the promise of maybe some more certainty wasn't worth it. And those are decisions that every pharmacy is going to have to make on their own. So in short, depending on what your organization's strategy was, the move from a traditional contract to an effective rate contract may have made all the sense in the world or not. So what is also very true is that there are pitfalls either way. If you think about traditional contracts with MAC provisions, those were unpredictable, wild swings in reimbursement that were hard to explain and hard to plan for. Effective rate contracts, however, don't offer a set it and forget it option, as it's extremely important to understand where the performance of the contract is versus the guaranteed rate. And by the way, those true up or reconciliation events I described are neither easy nor for the faint of heart. There is a negotiation there, a data-driven negotiation that you need to be prepared for. Additionally, like we've already mentioned, make sure that your contracts are as favorable as they can be to you in terms of definitions on brand, generic, inclusion, exclusions, and know your true-up windows. And finally, we do not recommend ever letting any sort of amount owed to you spill over into another contract period. That makes the next reconciliation even harder and harder. Try to get every discrepancy settled within that true-up time.
All right, thanks, Chris. That last point is so very important. Okay, so George, you mentioned PSAOs earlier, and we really hear this question a lot. In fact, we've already received it today in the webinar. So tell us what you think is the better option, PSAO or direct contracting?
Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on what the individual pharmacy or pharmacy chain strategy, business strategy is, and if that aligns with a particular PSAOs. So way back when, the strategy of PSAOs was, let's be in as many networks as we possibly can, and I'll be in 500 and the competitor's only in 450, and you went with the one who had the greatest penetration, right? That typically was what it used to be. But that's changed. And when I talk about PSAOs, I'm talking pharmacy services administration organizations. And, the big guys are Health Mart Atlas, Elevate, Cardinal actually has 3 of them, and Align RX. There's others, but these are the big guys. And so in light of decreased reimbursement, higher DIR fees, and the effective rate contracts that Chris talked about, and now that you have a great understanding of some of the vagaries around that, PSAOs they each adopted an alternate strategy, or as Adam Fine from Drug Channel says, it's divergent strategies. So some have left preferred networks altogether, arguing that the patients, particularly seniors, choose their pharmacies first and then choose their plan. Is their pharmacy in the plan that they will work for them? Other PSAOs have opted to be in network, but then leave the option of preferred networks up to the individual pharmacy. So regardless of the PSAO that's chosen, the prudent ones are going to pick the ones that balance profitability with participation, with your own business strategy, and also your own geography and your own niche, because you've got to take all those factors into account. And then also remember that regardless of whether you're in a PSAO or not, CVS Caremark, ESI, Express Scripts, and Optum, and in some cases Humana, will require direct contracts because they don't contract with PSAOs for their entire book of business. So you're going to have to utilize those best practices that we already talked about. And so when you consider, or you're even reevaluating your PSAO strategy, what you want to do is really start asking questions. You want to fine tune and get into some detail. So just kind of a couple that you may want to consider, what's your process for evaluating payer contracts? What's your stance on Medicare Part D contracts with DIR, especially with DIR moving over to price concessions at point of sale? What's your AWP rate cutoff for negotiations inclusive of DIR? If it's AWP minus 16, that's great, but then you got a 9% DIR, that's not going to really work. That makes it paints a completely different picture. So, do they submit MAC appeals on your behalf? Do they, are performance payments aggregated on all the members or just your stores? And then what about effective rate contracts? Do they aggregate all participants into that so that when there's a true up, it's spread across all members? These are things that you're going to want to know. Now, I'm no expert, but Chris has actually done, he worked for an organization that had both, they were doing direct contracting and they also worked for the PSAO. So I'm going to ask him to chime in.
Sure, thanks, George. And you're spot on, and a lot of your comments were things that we absolutely thought about in that former life of mine. When you think about it, right, for many pharmacies, the choice of a PSAO may be one of the most important decisions they make. Is contracting is the lifeblood of access to patient lives. So learning everything that you can about the why behind PSAO contracting philosophies will enable you to make sure that you have the right PSAO fit. And again, George, you're right. Even if you find the perfect PSAO fit for you, and I bet most pharmacies out there can find the right fit for them, PSAO still won't have every single contract you need to operate in your region, part of the country, wherever, even an independent pharmacy in the state level, right? If you're not a chain, these decisions are going to be really, really important. So in any instance, you're going to have to go it alone in some instances. So understanding these contracting best practices will remain a necessary skill. Beyond that, doing everything you can to understand how you can build a relationship with that PSAO provider is mission critical. So ask them, again, questions like, what data do they have that you can use for the best planning, best decision-making, best budgeting that you can? What reporting is offered and how can you best leverage it? So in short, in my experience, the combination of PSAO and the direct contracting that we had to do got us exactly what we needed. But again, it wasn't without struggle, and it wasn't without effort, and it wasn't without diligence, but the strategy worked and it got us what we needed.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, no good pharmacy panel discussion is complete without this next topic. And it's definitely one that we're all anxiously waiting to see what happens. Chris, so I'd like for you to share what you think pharmacies should expect, and really more importantly, how should they prepare for the DIR changes coming in January 24?
Yeah, loaded question. Thanks, Angela. Appreciate that. So let's first walk through what we're going to expect from kind of the data side, and we'll, at least in theory, right? So I'm going to take an example of a generic prescription here and walk you through kind of the steps and what we'd see in a retrospective DIR scenario like we'd have today. So let's just take a prescription that the total cost is $10.75, and that's an ingredient cost of $9.75 and a dispensing fee of $1. On this particular setup, the patient would have a copay or coinsurance of $10, leaving a planned payment to the pharmacy through their PBM of 75 cents. Now let's assume in this case we have an 11% DIR on ingredient revenue, or the ingredient cost portion of that. So 11% of $9.75 is $1.07. So retrospectively, the PBM would come back and take that money away. And at the end of the day, the pharmacy is going to end up with $9.68, and the patient is still paying that $10, right? So the money is clawed back from the pharmacy. God knows we're all familiar with how this has worked over the last couple of years. So now let's look at what we're going to do in January 2024 and going forward at POS price concessions like we've talked about. Again, in theory, this is the way this should work. So let's take the same prescription, $10.75, ingredient cost, $9.75 dispensing fee. Let's assume now that they place that 11% of DIR at the point of sale. So that drops that $1.07 that we're taking away all the way through. Patient now is going to pay $9.68. The plan is paying $0 in this scenario. So you can see that we're lowering the patients out of pocket. That was one of the key initiatives here, was to make sure that the patient was not disadvantaged at all by retrospective DIR. Now you're going to see scenarios too where the plan ends up paying less or has less out of pocket now or less payment to the pharmacy. So we could see some differences in pharmacy reimbursement. So that's kind of our level set here. So in terms of answering your question, Angela, directly, I think a lot remains to be seen. You know, you talked about that anticipation of what we're going to see here as we move into 2024 and beyond. But, you know, we continue to hear, oh, DIR is going away, DIR is going away. And I think that notion that DIR is going away is perhaps a bit miscalculated. I would agree that retrospective DIR is going away, but DIR is still going to be included in the overall reimbursement and in many contracts to the pharmacy, right? Just at POS now. And because of this shift, I'm afraid in some instances that we could lose transparency to how much DIR is really being assessed. But you know, time will tell. Deeper dive into Part D contracts, monitoring Part D plan submissions to CMS will eventually prove me right or wrong. And gosh, I hope I'm proved wrong on this one. So I think, again, understanding how the Part D contracts are contemplating, you know, all price concessions, rate, DIR, et cetera, will be a crucial part of negotiations going forward, and understanding how those concessions play off of each other or maybe don't. May mean the difference between success and failure for a pharmacy in contracting. Interestingly, we're still hearing of one retrospective assessment of something that might be akin to DIR for 2024. Again, caveat before, I'm a pharmacist, not a lawyer, but our plain reading of the final rule where CMS uses phrases like total and all seems to imply to me that their intent was that no retrospective assessment of any kind was allowed. But again, we're not lawyers or policy experts here. So this is really going to be fascinating to watch, I think, as it plays out. So the slide that you're seeing here on the screen, we've been producing this slide for a long time, or this data for a long time. And many of you have seen it, but it really always delivers perspective to this DIR issue. So what you see there is those initial few bars are DIR going all the way back annually to 2015. And then the last 4 or 5 bars represents a quarter over quarter view. So how this will change in 2024 and beyond remains to be seen. And I hope we'll continue to be able to measure DIR in this way so we all understand the impact. But so far, I struggle to see how we're going to assess DIR when it's baked into rates. And it's for this reason, I think we might lose some transparency. But again, remains to be seen. And I'm hopeful that we'll have clarity around the DIR issue in years 2024 and beyond.
Definitely. And, you know, the other thing that we realize and what we've heard from the market is that we fully anticipate that the term DIR will fade off into the distance, and there will be a replacement term that could essentially be the same thing, but not as transparent with the letters DIR.
Shocking, isn't it, Angela?
Yeah. All right. So Kevin, in thinking about all that Chris just shared, how do you think pharmacies can minimize the impact of DIR, or whatever it's going to be called, and optimize earn back potential? And how can chargebacks be offset?
Yeah, so it's kind of the same way it's operated for years. You know, at the end of the day, the vast majority of DIR is heavily reliant on improving star ratings and optimizing earn back. And, you know, we see DIR leaking into commercial contracts, but for the vast majority, it's going to be performance on these star ratings. And concerning thing is, as high as these rates for adherence and these CMR completion rates are getting higher and higher, you know, pharmacies are going to have to do more than just check the box. And I know historically, you know, we've gotten reimbursement for each task that we perform, but even that continues to decline. And I think it's going to be extremely important to supplement, not replace, but supplement human interaction with advanced technology. And there's not going to be a silver bullet. You know, every patient's going to have their own preference in how they're communicated or even how they're educated. And the interactions are going to have to be more frequent than just, you know, the task populating in a queue. It's going to be, you know, every time you see that they're not picking up their medications, and recommending those medication management tools and the adherence apps, you know, that are appropriate for the patient. You know, some things that we've seen be successful in pharmacies kind of first and foremost is performance reporting, kind of like the, like PQS's Equip platform, and just being able to monitor how you're performing there. I think patient identification is critical, so you know exactly who you need to talk to. But we've also seen pharmacies become successful with medication synchronization or appointment-based services that help with some of the labor as well. Some of the kind of newer, maybe innovative techniques is, as you have a Medicare patient come in and talk to you about Medicare enrollment, whether that's when they're aging in or during open enrollment, it's having kind of some of those clinical discussions up front and kind of being proactive to set yourself up for success. The interesting thing, I think, at least around CMRs, I know it takes up a lot of labor, and I'll talk about AI, which I know is a buzzword. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, right now, part of the eligibility is the out-of-pocket spend of roughly $5,000. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, they're going to have that out-of-pocket cap at $2,000 in 2025. So, the question is that nearly double, the number of eligible patients for CMRs here in a couple of years? So it'll be interesting. Like I said, at the end of the day, it's those Medicare star ratings, and I think they're going to be harder and harder to achieve. And we just have to find new techniques and more innovative technology to get there.
Definitely. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so we're about halfway through our questions, and I just want to remind everyone, take a second to submit any questions that you have through the Zoom Q&A option. We're going to answer these at the end. I see we have some that have come in already, so thanks for that. All right, so with this changing landscape that we've been talking about, Chris, what do you think will change with pharmacy and payer interactions? Are better days on the horizon?
Yeah, great question, Angela. And maybe fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at this, after 20 plus years of being in this business, I've developed both a healthy dose of skepticism and cynicism. However, right now, I think the answer to this question is hopefully. We've seen a little bit more of this collaboration for 2024 contracts, with DIR, and so I think there's some there, especially considering the wins that George and Kevin mentioned earlier. I recognize the role that PBMs play. It's an important role in the provision of RX benefits for their health plan clients. But we all know, we've all heard of a zillion stories of uneven playing fields between pharmacies and PBMs. And, I don't think the notion is necessarily wrong that PBMs have ended up with more influence than possibly they should have, depending on your view, especially as it relates to, the economics of drug formularies, rebates, things like that. But the battle that's played out between pharmacies and PBMs has been very real. Has played out not only at the negotiating table, but as we've heard, is starting to play out in state houses across the country and in DC. My reality is, and I think the reality that a lot of us share, is that pharmacists are extremely accessible. They're crucial members of the front lines of healthcare, and that's been demonstrated over and over again. And for me, the way that pharmacists rallied for patient care opportunities during the COVID pandemic closed the debate about the need to have pharmacists in that care setting, delivering care, provisioning care. And I think we as professionals need to constantly remind policymakers how important pharmacists can be delivering accessible care. So these things going on with increasingly deeper reimbursement cuts, those to me are just a threat to patient access, and no business should have to be reimbursed by a third-party middleman at less than the cost of production, right? I think it's safe to say that pharmacists at this point aren't looking for all the money in the world, right? I think rather a fair reimbursement for the product dispense and recognition of the time and expertise of the provider and patient counseling via an adequate dispensing fee would be a welcome start. And then you layer in on top of that patient care services with adequate and commensurate reimbursement models. And I think there is hope there, especially considering, the wins that Kevin and George talked about earlier. And for that, I have probably a better outlook than I have in a number of years.
That's great. All right. So, another factor with really industry is mergers and acquisitions. So George, can you tell us what you think about the M&A activity and how that impacts us in the pharmacy world?
Absolutely, Angela. I think what we need to think about is the buzzword. And the buzzword in the M&A world now is integration. Chains, health plans, payers, they're all purchasing companies or buying stakes in companies that are really just going to broaden their reach across the healthcare landscape. And what they're trying to do is develop their own health ecosystem. So they cover a patient, from the pharmacy all the way up to the hospital stay and everything in between that feeds into that. And so, provider groups have become the latest subject of acquisitions. And when I say provider groups, I'm talking about physicians. These have become the latest subject of acquisitions, which are really helping the people who are buying them, the health plans, the chains, to create these vertically integrated health systems. There's that integration word again. So one of the great examples of this is United Healthcare. They have recently completed the acquisition of Change Healthcare last year, but prior to that, and currently still, they're buying things like long-term care. They're buying behavioral health organizations. So they're creating that one-stop shop for as long as they have that patient. So what we also need to recognize is, and not necessarily, they kind of fall outside of the realm of an M&A, but these partnerships that have developed throughout the industry over the past several years. I mean, there's so much cross-pollination, if you will. I mean, so for example, we all know that Prime and Express Scripts have partnered because you may see that some of your Prime claims are being processed by ESI and using their MAC rates. But then Prime also has a relationship with Ascent, which is a GPO. That Ascent is owned by Evernorth, which is also owned by Cigna. So again, more of those relationships. Ascent also then has a partnership with Humana. So the takeaway here is that the traditional M&A activity has really given way to strategic positioning for an end-to-end healthcare solution for consumers. It's not necessarily all about volume. It's about, how can we service the patient throughout their, pathway to care for as long as we possibly can. Angela?
Yeah, definitely. All right. So, all combined, there's a lot of years of experience and expertise across this group, maybe even a little blood, sweat, and tears. So I think I speak for the audience by saying we're really interested to see what you think is going to happen in the industry over the next 2 to 5 years.
Am I going to start, Angela?
Oh, sorry. Yes, George, will you kick that off?
Happy to. Glad to do that. And I will admit to some blood, sweat, and tears. I will definitely admit to that. I think, from my opinion, there's a couple factors at work here. I think, first and foremost, you've got this rush to form these vertically integrated health systems and pathways that are controlling the patient and the dollars throughout the healthcare journey. I think, if you look back, the large chains have been doing this for years now. Now is the time for all pharmacies, regardless of the size, to align with healthcare partners, whether it be an urgent care clinic, a local hospital, rural hospitals, whatever it is, now is the time to really get moving on that. The second push out there that's really going to impact us is this push for payer reform. I talked about it earlier. I talk about it as a win, and I still believe it's a win no matter what. What they're after is a simplified drug supply chain and a simplified model. And the goal here is just transparency. And this is both a grassroots effort as well as an effort to support the larger organizations. Again, I'm talking about APHA, NCPA, NACDS. The third factor is, and this one's a little hard for people to swallow or even acknowledge, is the total commoditization of the prescription filling process. Reimbursement rates are not sustainable in the current market. There's this continual race to the bottom that we've heard about, and it's very real. And so we're at a point where automation is going to have to replace humans in order to decrease the labor cost, in order to keep this all viable. And then we need to think about what Kevin talked about or mentioned earlier, was where will AI begin to supplant humans in the process? So question. So let me wrap it up. All of these forces, I think, are going to work synergistically to consolidate the market. So my opinion is we're going to have less pharmacies and those that are left are going to be providing alternate healthcare services than they've done before. Think of as this expansion of what happened during the pandemic. And there's going to be a very different payment model associated with it. And my feeling is we're already seeing this. So that future is sooner than we actually think. So Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate it, George. Just a couple of things. I do think value-based care, I know we've talked about it all the time, but I do think that you'll see pharmacies start to become involved in those. You know, George, as you talked about mergers and acquisitions, we've seen these larger pharmacies acquire or partner with direct contracting entities like Oak Street Health and Village MD. And I think it's really setting, you know, the scene for value-based care and how all of these entities, you know, who are accountable for the quality of care can help each other at the end of the day to improve patient care. I think, you know, as I see the effort of the colleges, like the colleges of pharmacy, medicine, nursing, I mean, their classes are focused on cross collaboration and team-based approaches to care. And I think that as you see those generations, you know, graduate, I think you'll see more willingness to collaborate with this value-based care initiative as well. I think the downside is are pharmacies willing to accept both upside and downside risk, as most value-based care contracts are today. So it'll be interesting to see some of those things play out. Now, you also mentioned AI, and I know it's a buzzword, but hear me out. You know, whether it's GPT-4 or, you know, that kind of language or other AI solutions, I think it's going to be extremely important for the profession to embrace how we use AI rather than, you know, fear it. I mean, just think about it. If with health equity, and if we can leverage AI on how we communicate or provide clinical decision making, with all of this information kind of in aggregation or being aggregated, and you can simply just ask questions and find out more about how you should interact with a specific patient, or set up a CMR through kind of setting up that initial intake process. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to help pharmacists and even technicians perform at a higher degree with artificial intelligence. And so as fast as we're seeing ChatGPT, I mean, it's only a matter of time. And when we're talking about 2 to 5 years, I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of growth in that area, obviously. So I'll kick it over to Chris for kind of his thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So I think there are a few factors in my mind that will drive the landscape here over the next few years. The first, obviously, talked about it already, but the changing landscape of DIR and Part D. So we are seeing more and more of the 2024 Part D contracts. You know, and I mentioned again that 2 of the big 3 have opted to just bake DIR into their rates, and that's great. But again, I don't see how that improves transparency. Again, I hope I'm wrong. But I am very curious to see how CMS continues to report DIR over the next few years, again, from that kind of plan bid side, and then through, you know, reinsurance and risk corridors on the backside of those plans. That's where I think we're really going to understand the implication and changes to DIR. So that's number one. Number 2, we've talked about it a little bit, but the IRA, right? I think that's going to bring with it an Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sorry for those of you who I didn't get the acronym there, so my apologies. But Inflation Reduction Act has a few provisions that I think are going to land squarely in the pharmacy's lap with some new financial challenges that you know we're going to need to solve. So in particular, I think about impacts to 340B and 340B tagging on the front side of the claim, and then, you know, maximum fair price provisions are going to drive the need for new solutions. So, you know, again, most of the IRA provisions are a number of years off. You know, we're thinking about those things now. I know our customers are thinking about those things now. So there's certainly more to come. And then finally, you know, there's this factor that will never go away in my mind, and that's this reminder that, and I bring myself back to this all the time. Most of healthcare remains a local phenomenon. Right? Healthcare is delivered locally. So if you aren't CVS or Walgreens or United or whatever, there is still a path to you to bridge with other local providers and provide care. So my words of wisdom or whatever that might be at this point is, just because you don't have a stock ticker does not mean you do not have a path forward. I would suggest quite the opposite. You can do an awful lot in your local community to serve your patients and build those relationships to help provide patient care, because that's what we all signed up to do back in the day. So those are my thoughts.
Definitely some thought-provoking things there, and I really can't wait to see what happens. Just really some transformation, I think, that we should expect in the next few years. All right, so let's wrap it up with one last thing, and we'll turn to the audience here in a minute for questions, so don't forget to send those over. But George, can you summarize all that we shared today and really kind of call out what are the actionable items for pharmacies to take away?
Absolutely, Angela. So thank everybody for listening this far. Anxious to see your questions as well. So let's summarize. We've had wins. And in order to enjoy more wins, we all need to participate. And that means grassroots, state level, and also supporting our national organizations, whichever one fits your mode of practice. Know your contracts, and better yet, measure the performance of your contracts. There's tools out there, use them. The change in DIR is a win for patients. Let's remember that. It's a win for patients, but we need to understand how it affects, your individual revenue and your profitability on a day-by-day basis. So that understanding, knowledge is power in that respect. And then, I think Kevin and Chris and I all talked about how the industry is integrating and consolidating. It's faster than you think. And there's a need to really reach out and be a part of the larger system. And in order to do that, you've got to align yourself with other partners. You cannot just work in the silo anymore. And I think put very succinctly, it's get on the bus, or else the bus is going to keep moving. So, all right, so the takeaways, let's talk about those. Keep current on the laws affecting our industry. Know what's going on with the payer reform at both the state and the national level. As we pointed out, all 50 states have some sort of payer reform on the books. Some states have more than others. Take a good hard look at that and understand how it affects your contracts. Monitor the performance of those contracts. We can't say it enough. Measure and manage DIR, and the operative word there is manage your DIR. Adapt as it changes. Take some of the suggestions that Kevin put forth around how can you mitigate it. It's more than just completing CMRs. It's more than just completing MTMs. It's being knowledgeable about it. Manage the factors that affect your revenue. And these are basic blocking and tackling and, pharmacy business 101 type of thing. So, what's your usual and customary? Are you managing your usual and customary to maximize your profitability? Yes, discount cards throw a monkey wrench into that, but that doesn't mean that you stop managing it. Audit mitigation. What can you do to stop audits? Auditing is typically a mechanical error as opposed to a cognitive error. So there's always something we can do to be more efficient and to, get rid of the dreaded use as directed. Purchasing opportunities. This business is based on what you bought it at, not what you sold it at. Cost control. So I may be dating myself here, but if you've got a printer and it's got a duplexer so that you can actually, or it doesn't have a duplexer, so you're printing multiple sheets of paper for just something simple like your med guides, maybe it's worth the investment. Paper's not cheap anymore. Nothing's cheap anymore. There's all sorts of ways that you can just cost control. What's the cost of your labels? What's the cost of your vials? Change your lighting fixtures, whatever it is in order to control that cost. Embrace automation. Challenge your PSAO if you have one. And then, lastly, be aware of the shift in the business and prepare yourself. So point of care testing, prescriptive authority. There's some states allow pharmacists to write prescriptions. Are you doing that? Are you maximizing that? Does your website really highlight that and point you as a destination? Kevin talked about value-based care. Immunization. It's not just it's not just flu and COVID and that stuff. It's a much bigger business than that. Travel vaccines. What's the one I always forget? Smoking cessation is another one that goes down that. So, wrapping it all up here, the landscape has definitely changed. And fortunately, our fellow pharmacists, along with our advocates at a lot of these organizations, are really helping to shape that change. I'm bullish. on pharmacy. I think we're still a long way away from the transparency that we're all going to need and that we've all been seeking. But, as we get there, what that's going to allow us to do is to concentrate on the real patient care instead of concentrating on, am I getting paid for this correctly? So, it's all about the value that we bring to our patient. And so hopefully that gives you some good takeaways here. And Angela, I think we are ready to take some questions, aren't we?
Yep. First, let me just say, I would like to personally thank you all for your insights and candor. In case I don't mention it enough, I value and respect your opinions and your perspectives so much. I'm really proud to be your colleague. And I feel like our audience also feels that way. We're going to give our attendees just another couple minutes to add any questions that they have to the Zoom Q&A option, but can't skip a beat and miss the opportunity for a quick little plug. So for all of our attendees today, if you scan the QR code, you can get a sneak peek on some changes and some updates that we're making to our contract management solution. The enhanced solution will be launched later this year, and it's going to have more dashboards and really greater visibility that will help you to find actionable insights that will help you to manage these contracts better. All right, so let's take a look at our questions from the audience. It looks like we have a few here, ranging from contracting to DIR. I think we answered the question about the PSAO, but if we missed anything there, please send over a follow-up question. All right. Let's see. I'm going to let Chris or George take this on DIR, I think.
Yeah, so I know exactly what we're talking about there, Angela. I'll jump in.
You want to read the question first?
Yeah, it wasn't really a question as much as it was a suggestion, right? And awareness. So this is great. And so Harold, thank you. But Harold, just a friendly reminder, and it's one that we should have put out there. But if you haven't started thinking about it now, you need to prepare. There's going to be an overlap of DIR in the first couple of months of 2024. If you think about the run out from 2023. That might go well into the first trimester of 2024, combined with the live DIR takeback that will start January 1st at point of sale. Cash flow is going to be thin in that first quarter or trimester of 2024. So if you haven't started thinking about that and preparing for it, start planning now. So great reminder, and thank you for that, Harold.
Chris, there's a couple of others that are very related to that about DIR. Do you want to just skip kind of those?
Sure thing. The next question is, do we know if DIR rates will be custom to pharmacies' past performance or be flat rate across all pharmacies and plans? That's a great question. So we have already seen where there is DIR in contracts, we know that our customers are negotiating for those rates where they've been able to in the past. So I know that there are scenarios where PBMs are telling you this is what it is. There is no room to negotiate. I can tell you that different pharmacies absolutely are negotiating on DIR. There might be some of that. Does past performance indicate a future result? I think there might be some of that in terms of where DIR is coming through right now, but by no means is it locked in.
There's one more there about visibility to the DIR in the adjudicated transaction.
Yep, I'll thank you, Angela. So the question here is, does Inmar have any idea if we'll be able to capture DIR takebacks in the adjudicated transaction and provide claim level reporting to pharmacies? This is part of my I'm not so sure there's going to be a greater visibility and transparency paradigm that I shared with you today. So we do know that NCPDP has been working on some different formats of the the D.0 claim transaction format, but nothing is finalized yet. It's kind of scary. So right now, I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing some of these contracts with DIR just baked into the rate, because I don't think there is an alternative to see these things. So, I mean, this is my biggest concern right now, is that there is not a mechanism that I'm aware of today that's going to break down how, you know, the DIR portion in a contract versus the rate. Now, what we were hoping is that a contract would come through, and let's just say that the rate portion of it was AWP minus 16 and the DIR portion was AWP minus 5, and we could potentially back into some of those numbers. But what we're seeing right now is that, you know, it's all just being lumped into one number without a delineation. And so again, this is where, you know, if I'm saying like it remains to be seen how DIR will kind of shape up over the next couple of years, but this is the number one reason why I'm a little bit concerned about the transparency to DIR in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, and I think that answered the question. Do you expect the POC fee to be a separate line in the claims response? For example, how the dispensing fees report back separate. So for the person that asked that question, if you had a follow-up or something, just let us know.
Yep.
All right, let's okay, let's talk about pharmacy services. I'll let whoever wants to chime in on this. Can you speak to expanding pharmacy services that are not billed through the pharmacy system, billing direct to patient or their medical insurance? Chris,
Yeah,
that might be another one. Oh, Kevin, go
ahead. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't mind speaking to a few things that I've seen in the past, and certainly turn it over to Chris. You know, historically, before you've seen all the states kind of provide opportunity, you've had incident to billing where you kind of partner with a physician and bill under them. But, you know, a lot of what I've seen is cash-based services, of course. But what I've also seen, a couple more things, is I've seen some pharmacies be very diligent about talking to one of the smaller health plans within the state to come up with services that they can get reimbursed for. It's almost still operated through like an outcomes MTM, but it's much broader than just your Medicare star ratings. You talk to the health plan, you work together to load those newer opportunities like reduction in A1C and those types of things. And there are health plans within the state that are willing to work with you on that. The last thing I'm aware of, and most recently here in the state of Arkansas, is Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield has created the opportunity, at least for hormonal contraception education. They've created and partnered with a platform for pharmacists to go into that external platform to bill for those services. Now, I understand labor is you know, an issue, and you don't want to go out to other platforms. But nonetheless, you know, these state health plans are creating opportunities, which is exciting.
Okay. All right. Then there's the next couple of questions that are about challenges with negotiating with payers. But before we go to those questions, I'm going to kick off a poll. If the audience doesn't mind just answering the poll question real quick, we would like to just get your feedback on the session in general, and that way that helps us to plan for future sessions. We'll just give you a second to answer that, and then we'll move on to the last couple of questions. Thank you so much for indulging us.
Angela, in the meantime, do you want me to take the one on direct contracting and suggesting how to handle it there?
Yeah, you can go ahead to be talking while everyone's answering the poll.
And George, come behind me on this one if you want to. So the question is, when trying to direct contract, how do you suggest handling the payer when you've tried to negotiate better pricing and they get to a point of take it or leave it, and you have to have the contract, but it could hurt you in the long run? Classic catch-22 scenario. So thank you to the person who sent it in. The first thing I would say is I understand trying to get the best rate possible and making sure that it is the best possible financial situation that you have. But I would also say, are there other areas other than rate that might be beneficial to you in that contract where you are able to negotiate something more favorable to yourself? the fact that they were engaging in a back and forth with you to begin with in the first place is a good sign, and that you got to a take it or leave it means to me that there is probably somewhere in that negotiation that you have room. So finally, let's say that indeed you've attacked all of the areas of the contract where you have gotten the most favorable language possible, but the rate is just so bad. Believe me, we are seeing some of those contracts right now, especially in the 2024 Part D space, where the rates are so bad that pharmacies are choosing to walk away from it. Look, I am a pharmacist. I went to school to care for patients. I practice to care to patients. There's nothing that makes me angrier to this day. Here's this cynicism and skepticism coming out in full force, right? That I mentioned earlier, than having to say no to a patient or walking away from being able to provide care for a patient in your community because you can't get paid an adequate rate. So I would suggest, do everything you can on the rate, but also get every other part of that contract as favorable to you as you possibly can.
I'm going to add in a couple things here, and I know we're short on time, is that, to Chris's point, you do always have an option with those contracts. You can walk away. But it speaks to what we said earlier about measuring the performance of your contract over time. And, if you know how that existing contract is performing, and then now you're able to model it against what it is, sometimes just looking at a raw rate on a piece of paper, it looks bad and we get it, but when you model it, there are other alternatives. And to Chris's point, what other things can be wins? I mean, in any contract negotiation, it's all about give and take. And to Chris's point, if they were willing to, go back and forth with you, there's got to be a win for you in it at some point as well. So, there are always alternatives. We may not like the alternatives, but there are alternatives out there.
All right. Thank you all very much. Excuse me, very much for joining us again today. And we hope you found the session helpful. And if you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to one of us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.